Hi folks, I'm going to talk a few minutes about two poems which deal with the concept of suffering. The first, Musée de Beaux-Arts by W.H. Auden, tells us specifically in the first line that it's going to be dealing with this concept of suffering. So to give you some context, Musée de Beaux-Arts is a museum which houses many paintings by the old masters, a reference that Auden uses in line 2. Now, old masters refers generally to the great painters of Europe before about 1800 or so. So you can imagine Auden walking through this museum and seeing these old paintings. And what he begins to consider is this idea of suffering, and specifically one aspect of suffering. He says in line 2 and 3 how well they understood its human position. And I think what he means here is how well they understood how human beings react to suffering, how they act in suffering, what causes suffering. Old masters are sympathizing with human suffering. And so then in the images that we get in the rest of the poem, we get this dichotomy between the individual experiencing suffering and then between the rest of the world going on about its business. And we see this played out in a number of different ways. So in line 3 and 4, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along, right? And if you have experienced suffering of any kind, whether it's a death of someone close to you or of illness or injury or something like that, I think most people can relate to this sense of experiencing that suffering while the world around you seems to be paying no attention, seems to be going on about its normal daily routine, while the individual experiencing that suffering is going through something that's momentous, painful, life-changing, and that is a noticeable thing to the person experiencing the suffering, how other people are just going on about their business. And we get this next image, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there must always be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the woods. So again, you get this sense of this very momentous thing about to happen, the miraculous birth, the birth of Christ. People, imagine a group of people, very religious, devoted people, waiting for this momentous, life-changing thing to happen, which will also result in suffering in the crucifixion. But we see at the same time that children who just want to play, there are children, who just want to go about their business and not pay attention to this life-altering, history-altering thing that's about to happen. They never forgot, if we go to this line, they being the old masters, that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturous horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. So the same thing, we get this sense of this significant, momentous suffering going on. And at the same time and in the same place, we see these beings, these people and animals going on about their normal life. The dog goes on with its doggy life, the horse with its horse life. They're acting as if nothing is happening while at the same time someone is being killed, right? So we get that, again, that dichotomy between the individual experiencing the suffering and then the world around it. The second stanza, the last stanza, deals with a particular painting where we see this, Bruegel's Icarus, and I'm going to show you this painting here in a second. And I just want you to pay attention to the images that, Auden notes, right? It says how everything turns quite leisurely away from the disaster, right? The plowman, which we're going to look at in a second, may have heard the splash, but for him it's not an important failure, right? The expensive, delicate ship must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, but it had somewhere to get to, and it sailed calmly on. So let's take a look at this painting. So if you don't know the story of Icarus, you should go look it up. But here's Icarus down here. So the thing to note for Bruegel, for the old master, suffering is not the center of the painting, right? It's not the center of the experience. We have the plowman and this other guy here doing their normal daily routine. We have the ship that is obviously sailing off into the distance. And at the same time, Icarus is experiencing this significant suffering, right? And so, I think we get that sense with this particular painting that we've seen with the rest of the images of this difference between how the world views an individual suffering and how the individual views that suffering. The second poem I'd like to talk about is Milton's Sonnet 19, When I Consider How My Light is Spent. And I'm not going to walk through every portion of this, but I'm going to try to give you, again, some context and to talk a little bit through some of the places that might present some difficulty with this particular poem. So Milton is a Reformed Christian in the vein of Martin Luther and John Calvin in particular. And so this poem is very much about his experience with blindness and how to interpret that blindness and interpret that with his faith in God. And typically when we are reading poems, we refer to the speaker as the narrator. In this case, I think the narrator or the speaker is probably Milton himself, because we do know that Milton did go blind later in life, and in fact, he had significant experience or significant difficulties with his blindness as he's trying to write, to the extent that he actually had to dictate most of his writing to his daughters by the time he's totally blind. So this is a struggle for him, what you might call professionally, because he's unable to complete his profession because of his blindness. So in this first line, he says, when I consider how my light is spent, I think we could think about this in two different ways. This word spent can mean two different things. I think we could see it as, first of all, how I've spent my life, right? How I've used my time. But I think it also obviously refers to, probably more specifically, to him losing his light, how my light is becoming empty. He's losing light through his eyes. He says, before half my days, right? So by the time he's middle-aged, he says, I'm losing my sight. And he's considering this suffering, right? He says, in this dark world and wide, and you can interpret that in a couple of ways as well. Obviously, the world is getting darker because he's losing sight, but he also perhaps sees the world as being sort of a dark place, spiritually perhaps. I'd like to talk a little bit about line 3, that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless. So I want to mention this so that you know what talent means. So I think talent certainly means skill or ability. And I think in this case, if we think the speaker is Milton, he certainly sees that talent or ability to be writing, right? I think it's also a reference, a biblical allusion to Matthew 25. And this is where we get the parable of the talents. To give a quick summary of that, we have Jesus tells the story of the master who gives out talents to 3 of his servants, and a talent is money, right? So to one servant he gives 5 talents, to one he gives 2 talents, and to the last he gives 1 talent. He goes away on a trip, and when he comes back, the one with 5 talents has doubled his money, the servant with 2 talents has doubled his money, but the servant with 1 talent has gone and buried that talent and done nothing with it. And so the master becomes very angry because he's given this gift to the servant and the servant has done nothing with it, hasn't taken advantage of it. And so that's the same kind of conflict that Milton seems to be experiencing here. He's been given this gift, and yet he says it is lodged with me useless, right? And he feels like it's useless because he's having difficulty completing his tasks because of his blindness. And then you can also think, I think one of the questions I have there is, how does it affect his soul? He says, well, my soul is more bent to serve therewith my master. So it's this is certainly affecting him physically and practically. But he says, my soul has become more inclined to serve God through this, right? I want to spend a couple minutes on the center of the poem, I think, which is this question. Doth God exact day labor, light denied? And then he deals with this in the rest of the poem. So what is he asking here? I think this is the speaker asking the fundamental question about his suffering, right? So God, he says God has denied him his light, right? So again, thinking about Milton's blindness, he has caused or allowed Milton to go blind. And Milton is asking, does God expect me to labor in the midst of that? How am I supposed to? He's hindered my ability to labor, prevented me from laboring, from doing what I do because of this blindness. And yet, again, he's asking, why am I suffering and what am I supposed to do about it? And so in the next few lines, if you look from here down into the very end, God doth not need, etc., we get some answers to that question. In fact, he says, patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. So he asked this deep, hurtful question about God and his suffering, and then we get an answer. And I'm not going to go through each portion of this because I think you can work your way through some of the answers here. But the questions I've presented include things like, what does God need or not need? Something that the speaker addresses. Who serves God best, according to the speaker? And how can one serve God, according to the speaker? So I think this poem is, again, significant because it addresses this fundamental question of why am I suffering and what am I supposed to do in light of that suffering, right? And I think there's a lot of overlaps between this and Musée de Beaux-Arts as these two authors are asking questions about the nature of suffering and how human beings react with suffering. So I hope that gives you just a little bit of context for those two. I would encourage you to use the questions that I've posted with these two poems to get a little bit more in depth with your analysis, but I hope that gives you, again, some context and foundation for these two and of understanding.